Think about the last time you worked very hard for something and ask yourself honestly, was it for the thing itself, or was it to prove something? To prove that you are capable, that you belong, that you are not, as some quiet part of you has always suspected, less than. Alfred Adler was an Austrian psychiatrist who broke away from Freud's circle in 1911 and spent the rest of his career arguing that Freud had been looking in the wrong direction. Not sex, not aggression, not the unconscious battles between ego and id. The fundamental force driving most human behavior, Adler argued, is simpler and more uncomfortable than any of those: the need to overcome the feeling of not being enough. He called it the inferiority feeling, and he believed every single person alive carries it. Stay with me. Alfred Adler was born in 1870 in a suburb of Vienna. He was a sickly child, rickets, pneumonia, near-fatal accidents. He watched his healthier brother outpace him at nearly everything. He failed his medical school entrance exams the first time. He was, in the most literal sense, a person who spent his early life feeling behind. Later, he would describe this as the most formative experience possible. Not because suffering builds character in some abstract, inspirational sense, but because the experience of feeling small in a world that seems larger and more capable than you, this experience, he argued, is not exceptional. It is the starting condition of every human life. Every child begins helpless, surrounded by adults who are larger, stronger, more knowledgeable, more capable. The gap between what a child can do and what the world demands is not a trauma in the exceptional sense. It is simply the human condition at its most honest. And it creates, in every person who has ever lived, a fundamental feeling of inadequacy. Adler was precise about this. The inferiority feeling is not a pathology. It is not something wrong with you. It is the universal experience of being a finite, limited creature in a world that consistently exceeds you. What matters, what determines everything, is what you do with it. Adler observed that people respond to the inferiority feeling in two broad ways. The first is healthy compensation. You feel inadequate in some area, and you work. You develop genuine skill, genuine capability, genuine contribution. You move from minus to plus, as Adler put it. The inferiority feeling becomes the engine of growth. This is why Adler believed that virtually all human achievement has its roots in someone who once felt not enough and chose to build something from that feeling. The second response is what Adler called the fictional final goal. When the inferiority feeling becomes too large to face directly, when genuine competence feels too uncertain, too slow, too exposed, the psyche constructs a different solution. Not a real achievement, but an image, a version of yourself that, if you could become it, would finally mean you are acceptable, finally powerful enough, finally beyond the reach of the original feeling. Adler called this goal fictional because it is a story, a construction, a destination that recedes as you approach it, but it does not feel fictional. It feels like the thing that would finally solve the problem. If something in this is landing, if the description of the fictional final goal sounds like something you have been living inside without knowing its name, you are not alone in that. And this channel exists for exactly this kind of recognition. Subscribe to the Lucid Mind, not as a habit, but because these conversations are worth having. And if you want to share where you recognize this in your own life, the comments section is open. I read them. Karen Horney, whose work we have explored in a previous video, describes something remarkably similar from a different angle: the idealized self. The version of you that the tyranny of the shoulds insists you must become. What Adler shows is where that idealized self comes from. It comes from a child who once felt inferior, who constructed a fiction of who they would have to be to stop feeling that way, and who then spent a lifetime trying to become it. The fictional final goal shapes everything: your choices, your relationships, your definition of success, your response to failure. It is the invisible organizing principle of your life, and most people never become aware that it exists. Here is where Adler's theory becomes most uncomfortable. The person who needs to be the most impressive person in every room. The person who cannot tolerate being contradicted. The person who drives themselves relentlessly towards success and still, upon achieving it, feels nothing. The person who is compulsively generous, who needs to be needed, who cannot rest unless everyone around them is satisfied. The person who withdraws from any situation where they might not excel. These are not different personality types. These are different expressions of the same underlying dynamic. The inferiority feeling that has organized itself into a fictional final goal and is now governing behavior from below the level of conscious awareness. Adler introduced a concept that has been deeply misunderstood: the superiority complex. Most people assume this means genuine arrogance, a person who actually believes they are better than others. But Adler was careful about this. The superiority complex is not the opposite of the inferiority feeling. It is its product. The person performing superiority is precisely the person most in the grip of their inferiority. They are simply performing the fictional final goal rather than building toward genuine competence. The bully who needs to make others feel small in order to feel large. The perfectionist who cannot submit work because any imperfection would confirm the original fear. The person who name drops, who interrupts, who cannot genuinely celebrate another person's success because it feels like a subtraction from their own standing. These are not bad people. They are people whose inferiority feeling found an exit through compensation rather than genuine growth. And here's what makes this particularly difficult to see in yourself. The fictional final goal feels like genuine aspiration. It feels like ambition. It feels like standards. It feels like knowing what you want. The fiction is very convincing from the inside. Adler was not interested in pathology for its own sake. He was interested in what he considered the single most important measure of psychological health: social interest. Social interest, Gemeinschaftsgefühl in German, which translates more literally as community feeling, is the capacity to be genuinely invested in something beyond yourself, to act from a place of real contribution rather than self-protection, to care about the people around you not because caring serves your fictional final goal, but because they are genuinely there, genuinely mattering. This might sound simple. It is not. Because the person operating from an unintegrated inferiority feeling is, by definition, primarily concerned with their own position. Every interaction is, at some level, evaluated through the lens of, does this make me look more or less adequate? Every generosity is shadowed by, does this reflect well on me? Every relationship is organized around, does this person see me as I need to be seen? This is exhausting. It is the specific exhaustion of someone who has been managing their image for so long that they have lost access to the simple experience of just being present with another person. Rollo May described something similar in the previous video when he spoke about apathy, the withdrawal from genuine engagement. What Adler shows is one of the primary engines of that withdrawal. When your energy is consumed by managing your position, there is very little left for genuine contact. Social interest, for Adler, was not altruism in the sentimental sense. It was the orientation that becomes possible when you are no longer primarily in the business of defending against the inferiority feeling. When you are not constantly managing the gap between who you are and who you think you need to be, you become available to other people, to genuine work, to the actual moment you are in rather than the image you are projecting into it. Adler believed that the inferiority feeling could be transformed, not eliminated, but transformed. The path, he argued, is not insight alone. Knowing that you have a fictional final goal does not automatically free you from it. The path is courage and encouragement, two words Adler used with unusual precision. Courage, for Adler, is not the absence of fear. It is the willingness to engage with a task, a relationship, a challenge, despite the certainty that you will be imperfect at it. The courage to attempt something without the guarantee that it will confirm your adequacy. The courage to be seen as you actually are, rather than as the fictional version of yourself that would finally solve the problem. Encouragement, the word he consistently returned to in his clinical work, is not praise. It is the act of supporting someone's engagement with the task, regardless of the outcome. The parent who says, "You tried something difficult, and that matters, regardless of whether you succeeded." The teacher who treats a student's mistake as information rather than evidence. The friend who does not need you to perform your competence in order to belong. What discouragement does, and Adler spent decades documenting this in schools and families and consulting rooms, is confirm the inferiority feeling. It tells the person, your suspicion that you are not enough is correct. And the person who receives enough discouragement does not simply feel bad. They reorganize their life around avoiding any situation where that feeling might be confirmed again. They stop trying. They safeguard. Adler's great optimism was this: the inferiority feeling is not fate. The fictional final goal is not destiny. The life organized around self-protection can be reoriented toward contribution. But this requires, consistently, the willingness to be in the world as you actually are, limited, imperfect, capable of growth, and not fundamentally diminished by any of it. There is a question Adler embedded in his clinical work that has stayed with me. When he wanted to understand a person's fictional final goal, he would sometimes ask with deceptive simplicity, "What would you do if you were fully cured? If the problem you came in with were completely resolved, what would change about your life?" The answers he found were extraordinarily revealing. Because the fictional final goal almost always appears in that space, the thing a person cannot yet do because they have not yet become adequate enough to do it. The relationship they have not yet allowed themselves to fully enter. The work they have not yet allowed themselves to fully pursue. The version of themselves they have not yet allowed themselves to be, because that version would require stepping out from behind the protection that the inferiority feeling provides. You do not need to resolve the inferiority feeling to take the next step. Adler was clear about this. You do not need to first become adequate enough to act adequately. You simply need to act not, despite the feeling of inadequacy, but with it. This is the courage he was describing. At some point today, you will encounter your fictional final goal. It might look like the reluctance to submit work you know is imperfect. It might look like the need to be right in an argument. It might look like the feeling that someone else's success diminishes yours in some way. It might look like the exhaustion of managing how you appear to a room full of people you do not know. When you notice it, and you will, if you are looking, ask Adler's question. What would you do differently if this feeling were resolved? And then ask the more useful follow-up. What is one small step in that direction that does not require the feeling to be resolved first? That step, taken once and then again, is what Adler called the move from minus to plus. Not the elimination of inferiority, the choice to act in spite of it. Alfred Adler was dismissed for most of the 20th century as the lesser member of Vienna's triumvirate. Freud was the genius. Jung was the visionary. Adler, people said, was interesting, but not profound. He influenced Abraham Maslow, Carl Rogers, Karen Horney, and Rollo May, four of the most important figures in 20th century psychology, without receiving credit for it. He invented the concept of the inferiority complex, the superiority complex, birth order, social interest, and the fictional final goal concepts that have entered the culture so completely that most people no longer know they came from him. He was perhaps the first psychologist to insist that the goal of human development is not self-actualization in the individual sense, but the capacity for genuine contribution to something larger than yourself. In that way, he was also perhaps the most radical of them all. Subscribe to the Lucid Mind. Think deeper. Live clearer.